if you want to make a lampshade, you will need reasonable sewing skills and plenty of patience. Once you've selected the fabric, the lining and the frame, you're ready to begin. All you will need is some cotton tape for the frame and maybe some nail varnish for minor repairs. The cotton tape is very important. It is how you connect the fabric and lining to the tape. To find out how much tape you will need, simply run the tape around the top of the frame. You will need 2.5 to 3 times this amount of tape. It is much easier to control the tape if you clip it together as shown here. Start the binding as shown. Remember that you have to keep plenty of pressure on the tape because you will be sewing all of the fabric and lining onto this later, and you don't want it to move. Getting around the struts is not as difficult as it seems, but it does require practice. Finishing the binding is like finishing a stitch. You pull the tape back through itself. Next, we need to make a pattern for the cover and the lining. We mark it out so that we can clearly see where the bias is. It is important for drape to cut along the bias. This allows it to stretch and look good on the frame. Pin the fabric onto the frame. Make sure it's taut, that the bias grain is obviously going in the same direction as shown in the picture. Using a pencil and the frame itself, draw out the pattern. The pattern is quite simple in this case, as there are only 2 pieces of fabric to be sewn together. Cut out the pattern. You make sure to cut out along the upright lines. You can leave the excess fabric at the top and the bottom, and it comes in useful later. Make sure that the grain is correct when you lay out the 2 layers of fabric with the pattern on top. Using a protractor, which you can buy at any art shop, add seam allowances to the upright edges. Then you're ready to cut out the fabric as shown. Remember to add 4 notches, 2 on either side, to help line it up later. Remember to have your fabric face to face when sewing it together, so that the seams are on the inside. Make the stitches as small as possible, it gives extra strength. Try on the shade for size. See how the seam is pushed to one side of the strut. You don't divide it either side of it. The pattern you made for the cover is adapted slightly for the lining. We cut notches in the pattern, pin it together as shown, and cut some fabric from the center of the pattern. The top and the bottom remain unaltered. The method for marking and cutting out the lining is the same as it was for the fabric. Again, remember to cut out notches top and bottom, and don't throw out all of the excess just yet. We will be using some of it later. Using a tight stitch, it is now time to sew the lining together and test it for a fit. Pin the lining in around the bottom Then gently pull the lining up, turning down the colour and testing that the fit will be tight. Remember to line up the seam so that it follows the strut. It is now time to assemble the shade. We begin by fitting on the outer cover. Align both seams with the struts and push the loose seams to one side of each strut. We start by pinning the bottom of the shade. We don't need too many pins at this stage. Then roughly pin the top of the shade and make sure that you're happy that the fabric is sitting neatly on the frame before adding any more pins. Test the shade by drumming your fingers on the fabric. It should be taut to touch. When it is, you are ready to sew. A slightly bent needle is easier to work with as it goes around the hard metal frame easier. Pulling down on the excess fabric helps keep it taut when you're sewing. Once the sewing is done, cut off the excess fabric. A nail scissors is ideal because of its short curved blades. It is now time for the lining. Remember to line up the seams of the fabric and the lining. Turn down the collar at the top and make sure it's a tight fit. Pinning the lining to the frame, starting at the bottom. One difficulty remains: the strut for the lamp holder. You must cut the fabric at the top so that you can sew the lining to the rim of the shade. Pin and sew the fabric as you did the lining. You now have only one job left. You have to cover up the unsightly slits that you made for the lamp holder strut. This is when we use the excess lining which we saved earlier. The trim is designed to cover the stitching and doesn't need to go beyond the rim of the frame. It was a design decision to do so in this case, as was Isabella's choice of vintage trim. After pinning the trim in place, it is time to glue it. Once the first piece is glued in place, you can remove the pins and gradually glue the rest of the trim into place. To give a neat finish, glue and fold back the end piece as shown before gluing down the final section of the trim. A pin can be used to glue down any loose pieces as shown. Congratulations! Your shade is ready for use.